Welcome to Perfectionists Anonymous, a podcast-style channel dedicated to unraveling the myth of perfectionist living. I'm your host, Caitlin, and I'm a recovering perfectionist. I invite you to sit down, relax, and hang out with me, your supportive friend, who knows how difficult perfectionism can be and who wants to find a better way. Thank you for joining me today. Yesterday is gone. Tomorrow has not yet come. We have only today. Let us begin. Mother Teresa. Greetings, fellow perfectionists, and welcome to another episode of Perfectionists Anonymous. I hope you are all doing well today. As I write this episode, it is the first day of autumn, and I'm about as basic as they come when autumn rolls around. I may or may not have been pining for pumpkins and cozy sweater weather since the beginning of August, though, so at least I no longer have to justify my autumn love for all of you haters out there, since the calendar finally agrees. I kid, of course. Needless to say, I'm a happy little recovering perfectionist living during the season that I consider the most perfect of the year. In fact, I do find it interesting how much my brain likes to live in different times or anticipate times that I think will be more pleasant. Once the leaves have fallen from the trees, then I'll be pining for the first snow of the year. After the snow has been around for a month or two, I'll start to wish for the return of sunny days. And so it goes, in a never-ending cycle of time, a constant season of comparing my current place in time to one that I think will be better and solve all my problems. One that is more perfect. Which brings me to today's episode, centered all around the idea of being on time. We'll chat first about what this means on a day-to-day scale, then explore the bigger and more distressing idea that you also need to somehow be on time in the grand scheme of your life. Let's dive in. Punctuality, or the state of being on time, is upheld as a value in the current major structures of our society. We learn early on in school that being on time is good and being late is bad. You are given tardies when you are late, and they go in your record. Teachers scold you, the office calls your parents, they bring it up during parent-teacher conferences. It's kind of a big deal. In the school system, this usually comes from a place of good intentions. The educational system believes that it's important for kids to get to school on time so that they don't miss out on social opportunities and learning. They don't want them to fall behind. They want to teach them to be responsible. They want to instill the value of punctuality because they believe that it will help students learn to be on time and therefore successful. As an educator, I get this, of course, though I do also think that there is an awful lot of all or nothing thinking when it comes to being late or tardy. As a child who hyper-absorbed all of the should and should not messages expressed by the adults in my life, being on time was heavily reinforced as a definite should. You should always be early or on time. You should never be late. Being late is disrespectful and irresponsible. When words like that are assigned to an action, it becomes a moral value with little wiggle room. Context and practicality and understanding often get lost. Be on time unless you have a good excuse, or else. And I'm not at all saying that being on time isn't something to strive for, but I'm also not saying that it's something that we should live or die by. I used to experience absolute droves of anxiety anytime that I thought I was going to be late for school or work. I would run and rush around like a wild person to try and prevent myself from being late. And ironically, rushing around only made me make more mistakes. Dropping things, running into things and accidentally hurting myself, forgetting things, all so that I would arrive at my intended destination at the time specified on the clock that was supposed to be right. Being on time sometimes ends up feeling like it is all that matters. There's nothing wrong with being on time, but is there really something so wrong about not being on time? Well, there are a lot of cultures around the country and the world that would disagree with the idea that being punctual according to the clock is the most important priority. Many cultures and peoples that are not part of the very white programming that our societal systems currently run on may prioritize other things over punctuality, like maintaining a relationship or completing one task before moving to the next regardless of time. Who's to say that that isn't a more valid way of doing things sometimes? And who's to say that it's less? That's the point. None of these options, being on time, being early, or being late, is objectively right or wrong. It's what we make them mean based on what we are taught that really matters, and choosing what we want to make them mean. And now let's put this into an even bigger context. Because I bet that feeling like you're late to show up at an event or at work isn't the only situation in which you feel like you're quote-unquote not on time. Because the only clock at play here isn't the actual clock sitting on your bedside table, microwave, or phone telling you time. There's the ticking clock of life to consider. And boy, does it have some expectations. I think most people socialized as women, and likely many of you listening, would be able to recite the societal rule for when you're supposed to be married and have had your first child. You must do these things before you are 30, or you are behind. Bonus points if you've also managed to purchase a house and a car before you're 30, but really the requirement is the husband and the baby. It's a misogynistic, heteronormative, outdated rule, but it exists nevertheless. The social messaging comes through loud and clear in movies targeted to a female audience, especially rom-coms, and in a myriad of other locations. Magazines and clickbait articles are stuffed with tips to consider, if you're still single, to find you that man before 30. Romance books and television shows largely follow very young women searching for love, because that's the only appropriate time to do it. Otherwise, you become an old maid or a spinster. Note that there are not common use words used to describe a single old man. The narrative is reinforced socially as well, with a heavy focus placed on women to be considering their current state of partnership and their current state of baby producing at all times. My husband and I dated for 5 years before he proposed. During that time, I was questioned regularly about when we were getting married and when I thought he would pop the question. I asked my husband how often he was asked that same question. The answer? Almost never, if at all. But people socialized as men are not immune from the ticking time bomb that is life's clock either. People of all genders are fed a fairly forceful narrative about finding success after high school. What is trotted out as the ideal path is usually this. You graduate from high school, you start college the fall semester immediately after that, you know your major immediately, you graduate in exactly 4 years or less, you get a job right after college that matches your major, and then you are immediately financially successful for the rest of your life. Voila. If you deviate from this path in any way, then you are somehow behind. I think this particular narrative has become especially troublesome for younger generations because of the economic barriers present now that weren't present in years past. The cost of going to college, student loans, increasingly high interest rates, and exorbitant rent costs present additional challenges that just make us feel even more behind, even more late, even less on time. People of all genders also experience a lot of behind feelings when it comes to puberty and growing up and hitting milestones. Your first job, your driver's license, your first car, your first time shaving your legs, your first mustache hair, your first kiss, your first romantic partner, your first menstrual cycle, your first real date. There is a lot of pressure to not fall behind your peers when it seems like everyone is hitting adulthood faster than you. Kids who are late to achieve these milestones, well, they're not very cool. They're behind. And within all of these I'm behind narratives comes the expectation and understanding that the fault is supposed to be yours in this situation. If you're behind, it's because of your own shortcomings. If you haven't had your first romantic partner, but all of your friends have, then you start to wonder if you're unattractive, gross, or weird. If you haven't yet developed body or facial hair, but your friends have, then you start to wonder if you're stunted, immature, or childish. If you have to take an extra year to graduate from college, you start to wonder if it's because you're lazy, irresponsible, unmotivated, or disorganized. The expectation is that the blame is always supposed to be on you, which seriously hurts. It's painful to feel behind and then to have to experience all of the judgment that you're expected to put on yourself and your worth. And there is absolutely no ignoring the fact that all of this social messaging is out there. I think social media can make this on-time game even worse because of how easy it becomes to compare yourself to others in your life, particularly those that you grew up with or are currently growing up with. When you see classmates dating before you, getting engaged before you, having children before you, graduating from college before you, buying a house before you, then your brain starts to scream that you are so behind everyone else. What your brain doesn't filter in are all of the competing thoughts that could neutralize the ones of comparison. It doesn't tell you about all the people who aren't getting married and buying houses, and it doesn't tell you about the people who might be doing those things now, but who then experience quote-unquote setbacks later in life. But even that isn't the point, because we never win when we compare our timelines to those of others. We only create misery for ourselves. And what for? A subjective clock. A made-up timeline that we all for some reason decided to agree was the rule. And we know the rules are subjective and made up because they're always changing. In different times and places throughout history, you were an old maid if you weren't married by the time you were 16. You were behind schedule if you weren't contributing to the family workload by the time you were 6. If the bar keeps moving, then is there really any validity to where it's set at present? I could even go so far as to point out that time is a made-up construct in and of itself. Clocks, calendars, schedules, and social guidelines are all made up by humans. So is it really worth something defining your life by? Believing that there actually is no such thing as on time can be incredibly liberating, especially if we're talking about the grand scheme of life kind of on time. For the sake of argument, you could try and tell your boss that time is just a construct and therefore being late to work actually doesn't even mean anything, but that probably won't go over super well. It's technically true, but there are compelling arguments to be made for showing up to work, school, and classes on time most of the time. The key and operative word there is most, because what I have come to realize is that the world truly will not shut down if I get to work a little late once in a while. I still make a concerted effort to get to work on time, but sometimes life gets in the way, and I end up being a little late, and I am actually comfortable with that now. I know for a fact that I am not the only one who is late sometimes. And I also know that I can still get done what I need to during the day, even if I am late. Being late isn't a habit that I'm actively working to cultivate, but it's also not something that I'm willing to shame or guilt myself for anymore. It happens to everyone. In a lot of situations, it's perfectly justified, and the world doesn't revolve around my perfect arrival times anyway. But what of the other kind of late? How can we rework that thought? Again, believing and actually practicing that there is no such thing as being on time puts your life back in your hands instead of the hands of an imaginary clock. There is actually no set age or time by which you should or should not have had your first kiss. There is no set age or time by which you should or should not have had your first romantic partner. You don't need to be engaged by a certain age. You don't need to be married by a certain age. You don't need to have children by a certain age. You don't need to graduate from college exactly 4 years after you graduated from high school. Heck, you don't even have to go to college if you don't want to. You don't need to get engaged or have children either. And if you still want to believe that you do want these things and that you do need to do any of them by a certain age, then that is your choice. You can do whatever you like, but I think it should be clear that you do not need to do anything. If anyone tells you that you do, they're allowed to believe that, but you don't have to. Nobody can tell you when in your life it is or is not okay for you to have accomplished a set list of things that you may or may not even want. Your life is your own, and your timeline is your own. It doesn't matter when you do or do not reach a milestone, and it doesn't matter when anyone else does either. People may say that it does actually matter. People may ask you pressing questions about your timeline. You may feel judged, and you may still compare yourself to others and worry about being late. But in reality, in the grand scheme of life, the only right time is the one that you follow for yourself and for no one else, with the knowledge that those times may shift or change. Are you actually ready for any of these life events? Do you actually want them? The choices are yours and yours alone. I began today's episode with a quote attributed to Mother Teresa. "Yesterday is gone. Tomorrow has not yet come. We have only today. Let us begin." Living in the present is incredibly difficult, but it sure beats the alternatives. We truly are only ever guaranteed this present moment, and living each moment according to what you want to do at that time, in that place, is all that really matters. A social timeline made up by society doesn't have any business defining your life, and neither does the clock. Your time is your own. Make of it what you will. Thank you for listening today, fellow perfectionists. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more perfectionism-related content and to help the channel grow. If these episodes are resonating with you and you think they might resonate with others, please feel free to share it as well. Until next time, fellow perfectionists.